Hello everyone, I'm Carolyn Cumsty Fowler, and this module is our exploration of our individual and our shared values. Now, let me just set up what it is that we can expect in this module. You could do this work quickly. In fact, you could get through what's in this module in an hour. However, it's much more powerful when we delve into it deeply. And so I'm going to leave it up to you with the facilitator to decide how much time you want to spend working on the identification of values. So I've designed this module so that you can break it into 2 or even 3 sessions if necessary, so that you have the time to do this work. And whether that's in a formal lunch and learn or whether you're just working together as a team in your office, it's completely flexible and you can use it the way that works best for you. The leadership development cohort did the initial work of this in 2 sessions, but then they practiced living their values in many, many more sessions. So this is, in fact, an ongoing practice. Why should we bother with values? We've been talking about leadership development, and I want to share a quote with you from Henry Jensen Kramer. And I've given you the reference to his book and also to an article that he wrote in Forbes. Becoming the best kind of leader isn't about emulating a role model or a historic figure. Rather, your leadership must be rooted in who you are and what matters most to you. When you truly know yourself and what you stand for, it is much easier to know what to do in any situation. It always comes down to doing the right thing and doing the best you can. As we begin our personal growth journey into leadership, we always start with self-awareness. Now, self-awareness isn't self-involvement and it's not self-consciousness. It's bringing ourselves to a sense of awareness of who we really are, not just externally, but also internally. And I have this graphic on the slide for you, and as you can see, it's a tree. The tree is rooted. There is the trunk, which is sort of the core of how we show up, and then our different actions. And you'll see that there's an arrow going from the roots to the leaves, and that is a continuum from our way of being to our way of doing. Now, we are very, very, very busy at work doing things, and everybody can see us in action. Sometimes we're in action positively and people are happy about that. Sometimes we're in action negatively and people may interpret it in whatever way they do, but they may not actually understand why we're acting the way we are. And in fact, sometimes we don't even know why we're acting the way we are. So if we delve into this graphic a little more, what we'll see is that we have our actions, but then also we have our patterns of our patterns of acting, or our patterns of thinking, or our patterns of approaching the work that we do. And so if I'm a very strengths-focused person, my actions will always be grounded in that strengths focus. But underlying it all and under the surface, and often invisible to many, many, many people, are the values that ground us. And part of being able to act as leaders in a way that aligns with our values is noticing them and thinking about what that would actually look like in practice. As we develop self-awareness, one of the risks with thinking about ourselves and thinking about the work we do and how we show up is that we go to judgmental. Now, if you remember in one of the earlier modules, we talked about listening to ourselves and others, and we talked about background conversations, and we also mentioned that very often we are most judgmental with ourselves, perhaps even more so than we are with other people. And so as part of developing self-awareness, we also have to develop our capacity for non-judgmental curiosity. And so part of leadership development is to commit to learning about ourselves, but to doing it in a way that is kind and open mindset. So let's just sort of put the bottom line right at the top here. Our values absolutely define who we are. They define us individually, and ultimately they will define us collectively, whether as a team or as an organization. Now, one of the things that we often find challenging in organizations is that the organization or the organizational leadership may identify a set of values that the organization promises to deliver upon. And sometimes we feel really aligned with those values, but sometimes we may feel, maybe those values are the values that the leaders promised, and they aren't necessarily representative of who we are individually or as a small team. Now, while we are all accountable to performing in a way that aligns with our broader organizational values, there is great benefit to identifying our own values, and if we work in teams and small programs, to really think about taking the time to identify our collective values, because they are what ground us as a group. So what is then the power of having shared values? I'm just going to give you a second to reflect on that and think about whether or not you could identify how having a set of shared values could help you work better in your program and potentially as an organization. At this point, I want to pause and introduce you to somebody who is an inspiration to me, Dr. Monica Sharma. Dr. Sharma is now a consultant, but for many years, as you can see, she was the Director of Leadership and Capacity Development for the United Nations. And in that role, she led some of the major transformational programs of the United Nations, addressing really controversial and polarizing issues such as HIV/AIDS, when people were not prepared to accept that was an issue, sex trafficking, female genital cutting, and a lot of very sensitive and emotional topics. And she developed her conscious full spectrum leadership model to help bring disparate parties together to address the many aspects of complex problems globally. Now, I'm not asking you to address global challenges in your work at OHCQ, nor should you. But I want to share this quote from Dr. Sharma with you. When we stand for our universal values, and by universal values she means that there are many values that we actually share as people. And if you look at the bar down the left-hand side of the screen, you will see the universal values that the Leadership Development Cohort identified. But what she says is that when we stand for these are the greatest gift that you and I can give, because our inner capacity, when unleashed, will move us from resignation to wanting to go and work to make a change. So what does she mean by values and inner capacity? What Dr. Sharma says is that our inner capacity, our strength, our wisdom, the way we bring ourselves to our work is deeply rooted in our values. And so we can't step into our wisdom and our capacity if we don't have a clear sense of what our values are. So you'll see on the left-hand side of the screen that graphic I had with the roots, the trunk, and the leaves. You now see on the right a slightly different model, and this is Dr. Sharma's Conscious Full Spectrum model, and I'm going to walk you through it carefully. There are 3 rings, as you see, an inner ring, which is our tactics. Those are like the leaves. Those are the things that we do in action. The yellow ring is these are our patterns or our approaches to the work we do, and our values are in the green ring on the outside. And you might wonder why we've changed the position of values. And as I walk through this, I hope it'll become clear to you. Let's start with what we do all the time. So our tactics. This is where we tend to focus, and Dr. Sharma puts them in the middle of her model because we sort of narrow our scope of vision, we narrow our field of vision, and we're just absolutely fixated on the doing of what we have to do every day. And so as we approach issues, we tend to default to sort of our familiar tactics, whether it's a regulatory tactic, an educational tactic, a policy tactic, an environmental change tactic. It doesn't really matter, but these are the ways of doing things that are very familiar to us and essential to the work that we do. Now at OHCQ, the tactics or your ways of doing things may differ really quite significantly, not because you can't get it together to do the same thing. That's absolutely not the issue. The issue is that in terms of the work you do, many of you have very prescribed ways of doing what it is that you have to do, and that's important. And so we're not questioning the what you do in terms of your program and your program's requirements. However, we also have the next ring, which represents our patterns or our way of doing things. And Dr. Sharma talks about making shifts in our patterns. And let me give you some examples of shifts that we might make. We could shift from separate to connected. So if you think about the Leadership Development Cohort, the members represented many different programs with separate responsibilities and separate ways of doing things. They weren't allowed to adopt the same way of doing things, but they had come together as a group of leaders to say, well, how could we shift? How could we find connection? I'm not saying that our group was competitive, but in many cases, when we are trying to deal with different groups, we find that the approach is competitive. So I win or you win. I get the resources or you get the resources, or I get my way, you get your way. But when we can shift that to collaborative, often then we can bring our shared wisdom and our shared resources together. An important shift in this work, and one that the Leadership Development Cohort made, was the shift from reactive or immediately reactive to reflective. And one of the modules actually focuses on noticing ourselves in action and learning really to tame our brains, as our brains want to just react immediately. And then another is to move from being judgmental and instantly sort of making judgments about what we hear, to remaining very curious and humbly curious in our work. Perhaps the most important transformational shift in this work of leadership development is to move from a place where our mind is constantly full of all the things we have to do, all the challenges we face, and all the things we're never going to get finished, even if we work a 10 or a 12-hour day, which is, I think, a familiar place for many, many of us. And I know at OHCQ how unbelievably busy you are. So this is a reality, that we are really loaded and our minds are full of to-do lists. However, the challenge to us as leaders is to move to a place where we can become mindful and present, even in a place which is crazy busy. And I mention this because presence is something that leaders need to demonstrate. And I don't just mean physical presence, i.e. being with you or meeting with you in person. I mean being fully present. And I think if you've already done the module on listening to ourselves and others, you will have experienced what it feels like when a listener is present or not. And it is our responsibility to notice ourselves when we are less than present. Now, we practice being fully present and mindful while we discover our values. So we're actually getting a buy one, get one 50% off here. And we're going to approach this in a really mindful way. So let's revisit the conscious full spectrum and look at the outer ring. So the outer ring represents our values or our ways of being. And I'd like you to think about then, what do these three rings mean for us in our work? How could using a conscious full spectrum model help us align our work within OHCQ while preserving the integrity of each program? So if you think about the things that we do centrally, we really have not that much choice necessarily about what we do. However, that outer ring, that middle ring of our patterns, there we do have some control, because we can choose, even amongst programs, to decide that we're going to come at something reflectively as opposed to reactively. We could decide that we're going to really be strengths leveraging as opposed to risk avoidant. We have choices, all of us, in this yellow ring of our patterns. And this is what the Leadership Development Cohort did, which was to say, can we develop a set of shifts and patterns that we are all going to agree to practice? And then finally, the values. So let's have a look then at what this means for us, or what this could mean for us at OHCQ. Now imagine that this is OHCQ. So you see that we've now taken that full spectrum model and we've divided the full spectrum model up into 8 wedges. I know you have more programs, but it could be as many programs as you have. Now, I don't mind which wedge you pick, but just imagine that one of those wedges is your work. It's where you reside in OHCQ. Now imagine that another one of those wedges is another program, and perhaps a third wedge is another program. As you'll see in the center of the blue, we all have actions that are not necessarily unique to our programs, but these are the actions and the tactics that we have to use as a program. However, if as separate programs we are all able to come at our blue work with that yellow, that shared pattern, so reflective versus reactive or collaborative versus competitive, then we are all bringing ourselves to our separate programs in a similar way. And ultimately, what connects us all, what holds us together as an organization, even if we have different programs, is our grounding in the same values. Now, when we are able to do this, what we see is that we are able to remain aligned and consistent without being one size fits all. So now I'm going to introduce you to the process of noticing and naming our values. And I put the presence picture up one more time because I really encourage you to take the time to be fully present with this work. It's super easy just to skip through the slides and skip through the discussions and have a superficial discussion and wrap it up and move on. But that doesn't do yourself or your team any good, because what we need to be doing is really sort of trying to quiet the craziness in our minds with all our to-do lists and be fully present for these 3 sets of activities. So let me tell you what those are. In the first round of activity, we will be practicing noticing and naming our individual values, and I'll walk you through how to do that. And when you've done that and you're comfortable that you've done what you need to and that everybody's voice has been heard and that you feel comfortable and you feel that you've learned something about yourselves, then you move to the second activity, and that is where, as a group or a team, you will identify a set of shared values. And once again, if you look on the left, you'll see the shared values that the Leadership Development Cohort identified. Now, please don't think I'm suggesting you pick their values. I'm not. But these are the values that they chose. And then finally, and this is very, very important, once we've identified our shared values, we have to be able to describe what our values would look like in action. Because if you remember that tree and the roots are the values, but ultimately the leaves are what we produce. They're the fruits of our work and the way we do our work. And so ultimately, if we want our values to show up, we need to think about what would that look like in our daily work. So if you're ready, let's move to the first activity. We always start this process by discovering our individual core values and what we stand for. And let me just say for a moment that core values are foundational values, are not aspirational. If they're aspirational, in other words, something we want to become or something we want to believe, they're not core. A core value represents who you are as a person and what it is that you stand for. Now, some people will have one, others may have several. So this is the first process that we will embark upon. There are 2 steps in the self-discovery of my own values. The first is to know what my values are, and the second is to be able to declare them. And the way that we do this is not to explain our values or to justify our values. We simply stand and name them. And so, for example, I might say to you, my name is Carolyn, and I stand for respect. I stand for integrity. I stand for compassion, and I stand for resilience. And my values are my values, your values are your values. There are no right or wrong values in this work here. So how are we going to do this? We're going to actually remember that this is not about discussing values, asking for justification of values. This practice is a practice of humble curiosity. So what I will ask you to do is to take a moment. The facilitator will pause the video once I've finished the introduction. And you will sit quietly for a minute, maybe even two, reflecting quietly about who am I and what is it that I stand for. Now, sometimes this can be challenging because Dr. Sharma says, we don't stand for isms. So we don't stand for liberalism and conservatism. We don't stand for those things. We stand for universal values, the things that are fundamental to us in humanity. Now, once you've had a moment to think quietly about what your values are, the process is this. And you will take turns, just one at a time, to say, my name is, and I stand for. And it could be one value or it could be more than one value. Perhaps the facilitator might model this by going first. What we don't want to see is anybody asking, well, why do you stand for that? Or what do you mean by that? It could be that we don't know what somebody means by something, but we first will honor everybody's voices and let everybody say what it is they say. And potentially at some point after that, we may ask for more explanation. But it truly is that. It's explanation. It's not justification. And so you should end up with everybody having at least one, maybe two or three values in front of them. And I'm going to give you time to pause the video, and I'll be here when you're ready to join me again. So now that we have our individual values, we now then move into the place of discovering our shared values. Who are we as a group, and what do we stand for collectively? Before we go to this activity, I want to make it very clear that in developing a set of shared values, we are not being asked to give up our own individual values. So my own individual values are mine. So for example, if I look at this list of values on the left-hand side, I have a value of compassion, which is not represented there, but many of my values are represented there. And this is the flavor of this work, that we will not give up the richness of our values. However, we will probably find that there are several values that as a group we can all subscribe to and we can all stand for. The way we do this is what I call a post-it note exercise. So you will need some post-it notes. And each person starts by writing his or her values on a post-it note. And what's important here is that you write one value per note. So if you have 3 values, it's 3 post-it notes. Once you've all had a chance to do that, then you will gather as a group, and one by one, you will post your notes on a wall or a whiteboard. You can even do it on a table if you don't have a whiteboard available. Now, it doesn't matter who starts first, but somebody will post their notes, and then people will come behind them. If when you go to post your value, you see, for example, that somebody has already posted respect, and respect is one of your values, then simply stick your post-it note on top of the other post-it note, or maybe underneath it like a little ladder. We want to see them in the same place. And once you've done that, just have a look. Stand there in front of wherever it is you've stuck these post-it notes and have a look at them. Now, the first thing that will happen is sometimes people will say, well, that's very similar to that. So maybe somebody said respectful and somebody said respect, and or whatever that is. And so you can have a conversation, and what happens is that people tend to sort of tidy up the values because they realize that maybe these are so similar that they represent the same thing. And this is all consensus, it's all consensus based. So nobody can take your value away if you're not happy with that. And then just look. And what we noticed is that there were lots of values on the wall, but there were these, in this case, these 5 that were just hands down the values that had many, many, many people's post-it notes underneath them. And then you go to a conversation about, well, do these appear to resonate with us? Even if some of these are not our own personal values, do we feel comfortable with them? Could we accept this value as a value that our team or our group would commit to? And it's a really interesting experience. I really encourage you to take the time to just look at them, have conversations about them, and identify your shared values. And then once you've done that, I'm going to take you into the next activity and next step. But let me give your facilitator a moment to pause the video. So if we want our leadership and our work to be grounded in values, we need to think very carefully about what these values are going to look like in action. And we've talked about this before. So for example, if I have a value of respect, and I really respect somebody's opinion, and I respect their need to be heard and to be understood, then if when they're talking to me, I'm constantly interrupting them, or I'm distracted, I'm not paying attention, then that is not something that aligns with the value of respect. So when I am listening to somebody respectfully, I'm present, I'm making eye contact, or I'm indicating on the phone that I'm listening to them. There are moments of silence, and I am really listening with humility and curiosity to understand them. Ideally, at the end, I don't care whether it's a table or a piece of paper, it really doesn't matter, but ideally what we want as a group at the end of our work together is that we have some sort of statement of our shared values in action. And this is our way of saying, how will we know that our way of being as in the work that we do is consistent with our values? And it's consistent not only individually, but it's consistent in the work that we do together. And so at some point, you're going to take each of your values and you're going to say, well, what would it look like if those values were in action? And we spent a whole session with the leadership development cohort doing this. So the way that we do this is it's really a visioning exercise. And we will go through each value and we do it one at a time. And ask yourselves the question, if we were behaving in a way that is consistent with this value, what would it look like? And specifically, if others walked into our meetings or walked into the room, what would they notice about the way that we work together that would show them that our work aligns with this specific value? So what does respect look like in action? What does accountability look like in action? What does integrity look like in action? So integrity is not just that I bring myself with integrity in terms of the way that I work and the way that you can count on me, but it also means that we have a commitment to wholeness, like our commitment to hearing both sides of the story, not making quick decisions based on partial information. Document this. It forms the basis for your practice. And so it's not enough just to say, well, that's what it would look like in action and we move on. It's very important to say, if we are aligned with the value of respect, this is how we work. If we're aligned with the value of accountability, this is how we work. And the reason this is so important is because once you actually document what it is that you expect to see in action, if you're aligned with your values, then you're able to use it to strengthen yourself as a team. If everybody in your team has committed to a value of accountability, and yet certain people are not being accountable, then we can connect around the issue that we've committed to accountability, and how can we support every member of our team in bringing themselves to their work in a way that is accountable. So I'm not sure whether you'll have spent an hour on this, 2 hours, 3 hours on this. It's really entirely up to you, because we need you to do this in a way that is of most service to you and your team and your program. But let's be just transparent in closing. This work's not easy. It may feel quite unfamiliar, and in some cases, it may even feel threatening at times, especially for those of us who are sort of private and maybe a little introverted. It may feel very uncomfortable to have to share our values. And this is why creating a space that is safe and respectful is very important for this work. Living our values is not something that we learn and then we're good at. It's a lifelong practice. There'll be days that it's easy, there'll be days that it's challenging. All this and please note I didn't say but, remember we don't say but, and this work, this practice, can be absolutely transformational. And not just professionally, it can also be transformational at a personal level. And as one of my idols, Nelson Mandela, was famous for saying, it always seems impossible until it's done. So I wish you everything of the best with this journey, and I hope that you will find this work helpful to you personally and professionally.